You've been lied to about medieval peasants for centuries. Picture the average medieval peasant in your mind right now. I bet you're imagining some poor, starving wretch covered in mud, working 16-hour days for cruel lords, eating nothing but gruel and moldy bread, dying at 30 from diseases that a modern doctor could cure with a single antibiotic pill. This image is so deeply embedded in our culture that it's basically become historical fact. Movies, TV shows, history textbooks, they all paint the same picture of medieval peasant life as a nightmare of oppression, poverty, and misery. But what if I told you that this entire narrative is wrong? What if medieval peasants actually had better work-life balance than you do? What if they ate healthier food, had more vacation time, and lived in stronger communities than most modern people? Welcome to the most surprising historical revision you'll ever hear. Today, we're diving deep into the real quality of life for medieval peasants, and the truth is going to shatter everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. We're talking about actual wages, working hours, diet, health, and living conditions. Not the Hollywood version, but what the historical evidence actually reveals. Spoiler alert, medieval peasants might have had it better than you think. A lot better. The great medieval peasant myth. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Where did this horrible image of medieval peasant life come from? Because it sure didn't come from medieval sources. The myth of the miserable medieval peasant was largely created during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods by scholars and writers who wanted to make their own eras look more advanced and civilized. It was essentially historical propaganda designed to justify the superiority of modern civilization. Renaissance thinkers literally smeared the Middle Ages to make themselves look more revolutionary and progressive. They needed a dark, primitive past to contrast with their bright, enlightened present. The medieval period became their perfect boogeyman, backward, superstitious, and brutal. This propaganda was so effective that it survived for centuries, influencing how we understand medieval life even today. Most of what people think they know about the Middle Ages is Renaissance spin designed to make the medieval period look as awful as possible. But here's the problem. Actual historical evidence tells a completely different story. Medieval people weren't ignorant savages living in squalor. They were sophisticated societies with complex economic systems, advanced agriculture, impressive architecture, and, most surprisingly, working conditions that modern people would envy. The truth is that medieval peasants lived in a fundamentally different economic system than we do today. They weren't wage slaves grinding away for corporate masters. They were small-scale farmers and craftspeople operating in local communities with strong social safety nets and seasonal work rhythms that actually made sense for human beings. Let's look at what the evidence actually reveals about medieval peasant life, starting with the most shocking truth of all, their work schedules. The shocking truth about medieval working hours. Brace yourself for this one. Medieval peasants worked significantly fewer hours than modern Americans. I know that sounds impossible, but the historical evidence is overwhelming. Multiple studies of medieval working patterns reveal that peasants typically worked between 120 to 150 days per year during periods of economic prosperity. Let me repeat that, 120 to 150 days per year. The average modern American works about 1,800 hours annually. Medieval peasants, during good economic periods, worked as little as 1,200 hours per year. That's 600 fewer hours, essentially 15 fewer 40-hour work weeks. But wait, it gets better. Manorial records from 14th century England show that peasants averaged 27.7 hours per week when they were working. Even during peak agricultural seasons, they rarely worked more than dawn to dusk, and they took long breaks during the day, including an extended afternoon nap. Medieval people had Sundays off, that was mandatory. They also had numerous religious holidays throughout the year. In England, rest days and holidays took up about 4 months annually. In Spain, peasants had approximately 5 months of holidays per year. The Catholic Church, understanding the importance of keeping populations content, enforced frequent mandatory holidays. Every saint's day was a potential day off. Local celebrations, weddings, funerals, and visiting entertainers provided additional breaks from work. But here's the key insight that modern productivity experts are rediscovering. Medieval people understood seasonal rhythms. They worked intensely during planting and harvest seasons, then scaled back dramatically during winter months. Instead of grinding through the same schedule year-round, they matched their work patterns to natural cycles. During winter, many peasants worked only until noon. They understood that trying to maintain summer productivity levels during short, cold days was inefficient and harmful. Modern research on circadian rhythms and seasonal depression proves they were absolutely right. Even the much-maligned serfs, supposedly the most oppressed medieval workers, only needed to work about 5 hours to fulfill their daily feudal labor obligations. Manorial records show that if a serf worked a full day, it counted as 2 days' labor. The medieval work ethic would be completely alien to modern people. When wages were high, as they were after the Black Death, many peasants chose to work fewer hours rather than earn more money. They prioritized leisure time over additional income. This wasn't laziness, it was a sophisticated understanding of diminishing returns and quality of life that modern corporate culture has completely abandoned. Medieval wages and purchasing power. Now let's talk about money, because medieval peasant wages tell a fascinating story about economic life in the Middle Ages. The challenge with medieval wages is that most economic activity wasn't monetized the way ours is today. Much of peasant income came in the form of land use rights, food allowances, housing, and other non-cash benefits that are difficult to quantify in modern terms. But when peasants did work for wages, especially during labor shortages, after plagues or wars, they earned surprisingly good money relative to living costs. A skilled agricultural laborer in 14th century England could earn about 4 pence per day during harvest season. This doesn't sound like much until you realize that a gallon of ale cost about 3 pence and a pound of wheat cost roughly 2 pence, so a day's wage could buy substantial food supplies. More importantly, peasants usually didn't need to buy food, they grew it themselves. Their wages were essentially spending money for manufactured goods, tools, clothing, and luxuries. Medieval people also operated in what economists call a moral economy rather than a pure market economy. Prices were regulated by custom and community pressure. Landlords and employers who charged excessive rents or paid unfair wages faced social ostracism and sometimes violent resistance. The medieval economy included numerous built-in protections that don't exist today. Guilds regulated working conditions and prices. The church provided social services and charity. Local communities supported members during hardships. Seasonal work patterns meant that everybody understood economic rhythms and planned accordingly. Perhaps most importantly, medieval peasants had access to land, the fundamental means of production in an agricultural economy. Even serfs had hereditary rights to specific plots that couldn't be arbitrarily taken away. This provided economic security that modern wage workers can't imagine. Land tenure meant that peasants weren't dependent on employers for survival. They might work for wages during busy seasons, but they always had their own land to fall back on. This gave them bargaining power that modern workers lack. When medieval peasants went on strike, and they did frequently, they could afford to wait out employers because they weren't facing homelessness and starvation. They had their own food production and community support systems. The purchasing power analysis gets even more interesting when we look at what medieval people could afford relative to their income. A medieval craftsman's annual earnings could buy a substantial house. A peasant family's surplus production could purchase land, livestock, or trade goods that would set them up for generations. Medieval people also had lower living costs in many ways. Housing was often provided as part of land tenure agreements. Food came from their own production. Community resources like mills, ovens, and workshops were shared. Transportation costs were minimal because most economic activity was local. The diet revolution, what medieval peasants actually ate. Prepare to have your mind blown about medieval peasant nutrition because recent archaeological evidence reveals that peasants ate better than most people realize, and in some ways better than modern people. For decades, historians assumed medieval peasants survived on bread, gruel, and the occasional scrap of meat. This assumption was based on limited documentary evidence and a lot of speculation about what poor people must have eaten. But modern food archaeology has revolutionized our understanding of medieval diets. By analyzing cooking pot residues, animal bones, and other physical evidence from medieval peasant settlements, scientists have discovered that peasants ate remarkably varied and nutritious diets. Dr. Julie Dunn at the University of Bristol led groundbreaking research analyzing pottery fragments from West Cotton, a medieval peasant village in Northamptonshire. Her team found evidence of meat stews containing beef and mutton, vegetables like cabbage and leeks, dairy products including green cheeses, and various grains and legumes. The findings showed that stews and pottages containing meat and vegetables were the mainstay of the medieval peasant diet. These weren't occasional treats, they were everyday meals. Medieval peasants consumed an estimated 2,900 calories per day for adult males and 2,150 calories for adult females. That's comparable to or higher than many modern diets, and the food quality was often superior. Medieval peasant diets included meat, beef, mutton, pork, and poultry were common. Peasants often raised their own animals and had access to game through various legal and illegal means. Bacon was a winter staple that provided crucial fats and proteins during cold months. Dairy, milk, butter, and various cheeses provided calcium and protein. Many peasant families kept cows or goats, making dairy products readily available. Vegetables, cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, carrots, parsnips, peas, and beans were standard. Medieval people cultivated extensive gardens and understood crop rotation and companion planting. Grains, barley, oats, rye, and wheat provided carbohydrates and B vitamins. Bread was important, but porridges and stews were equally common. Alcohol, beer and ale provided calories, B vitamins, and safe hydration. Medieval people drank alcohol throughout the day because it was often safer than water. The most surprising discovery is how much meat medieval peasants consumed. Contrary to popular belief, meat wasn't a rare luxury, it was a regular part of the diet. Archaeological evidence from peasant settlements shows abundant animal bones, indicating frequent meat consumption. Medieval people also understood nutrition in practical ways that modern people have forgotten. They combined grains and legumes to create complete proteins. They fermented foods for better digestibility and preservation. They used herbs and spices not just for flavor, but for their medicinal properties. The seasonal variation in medieval diets actually provided better nutrition than year-round standardized eating. Summer abundance of fresh vegetables and fruits provided vitamins and minerals. Winter reliance on preserved meats and fermented foods supported gut health and provided sustained energy during cold months. Perhaps most importantly, medieval food was unprocessed and locally produced. No pesticides, no artificial additives, no industrial agriculture. Everything was organic by default, and food miles were measured in feet rather than thousands of miles. Recent studies suggest that the medieval peasant diet was more nutritionally complete than many modern diets, which are high in processed foods and lacking in essential nutrients. Medieval people may have been healthier than we assumed. Their diet certainly was. Medieval housing and living conditions. The medieval peasant house has been caricatured as a filthy hovel shared with animals, but archaeological evidence reveals a more complex and often more comfortable reality. Yes, medieval peasant houses were small by modern standards, typically 1 or 2 rooms, but they were well adapted to climate, available materials, and lifestyle needs. These weren't primitive shelters, they were sophisticated examples of sustainable architecture. Medieval houses used local materials efficiently, timber framing with wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs that provided excellent insulation, and strategic placement to maximize warmth and minimize exposure to harsh weather. The central hearth wasn't just for cooking, it was the technological and social center of the house. It provided heat, light, cooking capability, and a gathering place for family activities. The smoke from the hearth helped preserve stored food and prevented pest infestations. Modern people are often horrified by the idea of sharing living space with animals, but this arrangement made perfect economic and practical sense. Animals provided warmth during winter months, protection for valuable livestock, and efficient use of limited space. The arrangement also allowed for immediate care of animals during harsh weather or illness. Medieval people weren't living in squalor with their animals. They were practicing integrated household management that maximized efficiency and survival in a pre-industrial economy. Housing improved significantly throughout the medieval period. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many peasant houses had separate rooms, better windows, and more sophisticated construction. The period even saw what historians call the Great Rebuilding, when improved economic conditions allowed peasants to upgrade their housing substantially. Medieval villages provided community resources that individual houses didn't need to include. Communal ovens for baking, mills for grinding grain, workshops for specialized crafts, and public spaces for gatherings meant that peasant houses could focus on basic shelter and family life while relying on shared infrastructure for other needs. The village layout itself was planned for efficiency and social cohesion. Houses clustered around common areas, with fields arranged in strips that allowed for cooperative farming and shared resources. This wasn't random development. It was sophisticated community planning. Medieval people also understood hygiene better than popular culture suggests. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval communities had garbage disposal systems, animal waste management, and personal cleanliness practices. The idea that medieval people were constantly dirty is another Renaissance-era myth. Houses included furniture like stools, tables, storage chests, and beds. While sparse by modern standards, medieval peasant homes contained the essentials for comfortable living according to contemporary needs and expectations. Privacy wasn't a medieval concept the way it is today, but that doesn't mean living conditions were unbearable. Large families in small spaces developed social customs and arrangements that managed crowding effectively. Multiple generations living together provided childcare, elder care, and knowledge transfer that modern nuclear families often lack. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that peasants spent less time indoors than modern people. During good weather, most activities moved outside, making small houses less claustrophobic than they might seem to modern sensibilities. Health, medicine, and life expectancy. The question of medieval life expectancy is where things get really interesting because the standard narrative is both true and misleading at the same time. Yes, medieval life expectancy was lower than modern life expectancy, but the reasons are more complex than most people understand, and the gap was smaller than popular culture suggests. Medieval life expectancy statistics are heavily skewed by infant and childhood mortality. If you died before age 5, which unfortunately many children did, you brought down the average life expectancy for everyone. But if you survived childhood, your chances of living to 60 or 70 were much better than the overall statistics suggest. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries shows that people who survived to adulthood often lived well into their 60s and 70s. Queens, dukes, monks, and other well-documented individuals frequently lived into their 80s and beyond. Bishop Gilbert of Sempringham retired at age 89. The Duke of Norfolk died in battle at age 75. The main killers in medieval times were infectious diseases, complications from childbirth, and accidents. These weren't necessarily related to poor living conditions or nutrition. They were the result of limited medical knowledge and technology. Medieval people weren't necessarily less healthy than modern people in terms of chronic diseases. In fact, they may have been healthier in some ways. Medieval peasants got enormous amounts of physical exercise through their daily work. Their diets were unprocessed and nutrient-dense. They weren't exposed to industrial pollution, processed foods, or many of the health hazards of modern life. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons show evidence of strong bones, well-developed musculature, and relatively low rates of diseases associated with poor nutrition. Medieval people weren't the malnourished, stunted population that popular culture imagines. Medieval medicine was more sophisticated than people realize. Herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and practical health knowledge were passed down through generations. Monasteries served as medical centers and research institutions. Medieval people understood the importance of hygiene, rest, and proper nutrition for health. The medieval understanding of mental health was actually quite advanced. Communities provided support systems for people with various conditions. The idea of care for the elderly, disabled, and mentally ill was embedded in religious and social customs. Medieval people also had better work-life balance, which contributed to mental and physical health. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural work, frequent holidays, and strong community bonds provided psychological benefits that modern people often lack. Stress levels may have been lower in many ways. While medieval people faced different challenges than modern people, they weren't dealing with the chronic stress of modern urban life, financial insecurity in a wage economy, or the psychological pressures of constant connectivity and information overload. The mortality gap between medieval and modern times is primarily due to medical technology, not lifestyle factors. Antibiotics, vaccines, surgical techniques, and emergency medical care prevent deaths that would have been inevitable in medieval times. But for conditions that don't require medical intervention, medieval people may have been healthier than modern people. Recent studies of traditional societies suggest that pre-industrial peoples often had lower rates of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and other chronic conditions that plague modern populations. Medieval peasants, with their active lifestyles and whole food diets, may have enjoyed better metabolic health than many modern people. Social mobility and economic opportunity. One of the biggest myths about medieval society is that social mobility was impossible, that peasants were trapped in their class forever with no hope of advancement. The reality is much more complex and surprising. Medieval society was hierarchical, but it wasn't static. Social mobility existed at multiple levels, and ambitious peasants had numerous pathways to improve their circumstances. The most direct path to advancement was economic success in agriculture or trade. Peasants who were skilled farmers could accumulate surplus production, buy or lease additional land, and eventually become substantial landowners themselves. Successful peasants could send their children to schools, apprentice them to craftsmen, or even fund their entry into religious orders. The wool trade in medieval England created numerous opportunities for peasant advancement. Skilled shepherds and wool traders could accumulate significant wealth and social status. Some peasant families became wealthy enough to finance the construction of wool churches and other public buildings. Military service provided another avenue for advancement. Peasants who distinguished themselves in warfare could earn rewards, land grants, and social recognition. The medieval military system relied heavily on common soldiers, and successful military careers could lead to significant social advancement. The church offered perhaps the most dramatic opportunities for social mobility. Intelligent peasant children could enter religious orders, receive education, and rise through ecclesiastical hierarchies. Some peasants' sons became bishops, abbots, and even popes. Religious careers were genuinely meritocratic in ways that secular careers often weren't. Craft specialization allowed peasants to move into higher status occupations. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, and others commanded respect and better income than basic agricultural laborers. Craft guilds provided protection, training, and social advancement opportunities. Medieval towns and cities offered additional opportunities for ambitious peasants. Urban areas needed laborers, craftsmen, merchants, and service providers. Peasants who moved to towns could often improve their economic status and gain more personal freedom. Marriage was another mechanism for social advancement. Successful peasant families could arrange marriages that improved their social and economic position. A skilled farmer's daughter might marry into a merchant family, or a successful craftsman might marry into minor nobility. The medieval economy also provided opportunities for entrepreneurship. Peasants could establish mills, breweries, markets, and other businesses. Some peasant families became wealthy merchants or landowners through successful business ventures. Legal advancement was possible through various means. Peasants could purchase their freedom from serfdom, acquire citizenship in towns, or earn legal privileges through service or achievement. Medieval legal systems included mechanisms for changing status and acquiring rights. Education, while limited, was available to ambitious peasants. Monastery schools, cathedral schools, and eventually universities provided pathways for intellectual advancement. Literacy and learning were valued and could lead to careers in administration, law, or religious service. The key insight is that medieval society, while stratified, was more fluid than popular culture suggests. Social advancement required luck, skill, and determination, but it was possible. Many medieval peasant families improved their circumstances over generations through careful planning and hard work. Medieval people understood that social advancement was a long-term, multi-generational project. They invested in their children's education, accumulated resources for future opportunities, and built social networks that could provide advancement possibilities. Community life and social support. Perhaps the most significant difference between medieval and modern life was the strength of community bonds and social support systems. Medieval peasants lived in tight-knit communities that provided economic, social, and emotional support that modern people often lack. Medieval villages were organic communities where everyone knew everyone else, and individual welfare was tied to community welfare. This created strong incentives for mutual aid and cooperation that modern urban life often lacks. The medieval economic system included numerous community-based support mechanisms. Harvest time required cooperation between families. Barn raising, house building, and other major projects were community efforts. Shared resources like mills, ovens, and workshops meant that individual families didn't need to own everything independently. Religious institutions provided a social safety net that went far beyond spiritual services. Churches and monasteries provided charity, medical care, education, and support for orphans, widows, and the elderly. Religious festivals and celebrations created regular opportunities for community bonding and mutual support. Guild systems in towns and cities provided professional support, training, and protection for craftsmen and merchants. Guilds weren't just economic organizations. They were social institutions that provided healthcare, widow support, apprenticeship programs, and community leadership. Medieval communities had strong customs around mutual aid during crises. Families helped each other during illness, bad harvests, fires, and other emergencies. These weren't formal insurance systems, but they were effective social support networks based on reciprocity and shared responsibility. Marriage and family systems created extensive kinship networks that provided economic and social support. Large families meant more workers during busy seasons, more hands to care for children and elderly, and more people to rely on during difficult times. Local governance was often participatory in ways that modern politics isn't. Village assemblies, manor courts, and guild meetings gave ordinary people direct input into decisions that affected their lives. Medieval people had more control over their immediate environment than modern people often do. Seasonal celebrations, religious festivals, and community events provided regular opportunities for social bonding, entertainment, and cultural expression. Medieval people had rich social lives centered around community activities rather than individual consumption. The moral economy meant that community pressure regulated economic behavior. Landlords, employers, and merchants who exploited their neighbors faced social consequences. This created incentives for fair dealing and mutual respect that modern market economies often lack. Medieval communities also provided psychological and emotional support that modern people might seek from therapists or other professionals. Close-knit communities meant that personal problems were shared problems, and community wisdom helped individuals navigate life challenges. Work was often communal rather than individual. Farming, crafts, and other activities were done in groups, creating social interaction and mutual support. Modern people working alone in offices or from home missed the social benefits of communal work. Medieval people had stronger intergenerational connections than modern people. Children learned from grandparents, adults cared for elderly parents, and knowledge was passed down through family and community networks. This created continuity and stability that modern nuclear families often lack. The dark side. Real challenges of medieval peasant life. Now let's be honest about the genuine hardships and limitations of medieval peasant life, because romanticizing the past isn't helpful either. Medieval peasants faced real constraints on their freedom that modern people would find intolerable. Serfs couldn't leave their lord's land without permission. They couldn't marry without approval. They couldn't move to seek better opportunities elsewhere. These restrictions, while economically rational within the feudal system, limited personal autonomy in ways that modern people value highly. Legal protections were limited and unevenly enforced. Peasants had fewer rights than nobility and were subject to arbitrary decisions by lords and local officials. Justice was often rough and sometimes brutal. While peasants weren't as powerless as popular culture suggests, they certainly had less legal protection than modern people. Economic insecurity was a constant concern. Bad harvests, disease, war, and other disasters could devastate peasant families. While communities provided support systems, these weren't always sufficient to prevent real hardship. Medieval people lived closer to subsistence than most modern people, making them more vulnerable to economic shocks. Women faced significant restrictions and discrimination. While peasant women often had more practical equality than noble women, they still faced legal and social limitations that modern women would find unacceptable. Property rights, legal standing, and personal autonomy were all constrained by gender in ways that limited women's opportunities. Medical limitations meant that treatable diseases could be fatal, injuries could cause permanent disability, and childbirth was genuinely dangerous. While medieval medicine was more sophisticated than often assumed, it couldn't address many conditions that modern medicine treats routinely. Educational opportunities were extremely limited. Most peasants remained illiterate throughout their lives. While practical knowledge was extensive and sophisticated, formal education was restricted to a small elite. This limited intellectual development and social advancement opportunities. Technology limitations meant that daily life required more physical labor and provided fewer conveniences than modern life. Simple tasks like food preparation, heating, lighting, and transportation required significantly more time and effort than modern people are accustomed to. Violence was more common than in modern society. While medieval people weren't constantly fighting, the potential for violence from war, crime, and civil disorder was higher than in modern developed countries. Personal security was less assured than modern people expect. Religious and social conformity was enforced more strictly than modern people would tolerate. Individual expression, religious freedom, and social deviation were limited by community pressure and institutional authority. Medieval people had less freedom to choose their own beliefs and lifestyles. Environmental hazards that modern people take for granted were serious concerns. Fire, flooding, storms, and other natural disasters could devastate communities. Building standards and urban planning were less sophisticated, making people more vulnerable to environmental risks. Reframing medieval peasant life. So, did medieval peasants really have it that bad? The answer is, it depends on what you mean by bad and what you're comparing it to. Medieval peasant life was definitely harder than modern middle-class life in developed countries. Medical care was limited, technology was primitive, legal protections were weaker, and personal freedoms were more restricted. No reasonable person would choose to give up modern conveniences and protections to live like a medieval peasant. But medieval peasant life was also much better than popular culture portrays. Peasants weren't starving, oppressed wretches living in constant misery. They were members of functioning communities with economic security, social support, work-life balance, and quality of life that modern people might envy in some ways. The most important insight is that medieval peasants lived in a fundamentally different kind of society than modern people. They weren't failed modern people. They were successful medieval people operating in an economic and social system that prioritized different values than modern society. Medieval society emphasized community over individualism, seasonal rhythms over constant productivity, local relationships over global markets, and social stability over economic growth. These weren't necessarily worse priorities. They were different priorities that created different kinds of opportunities and constraints. Modern people who work more hours than medieval peasants, eat processed food instead of fresh local ingredients, live in isolated nuclear families instead of supportive communities, and struggle with chronic stress and lifestyle diseases, might legitimately wonder whether progress has made life better in all ways. The medieval peasant life model offers insights that modern people can learn from: the importance of seasonal rhythms, community support, work-life balance, local food systems, and economic arrangements that prioritize human welfare over abstract productivity. Obviously, we shouldn't romanticize medieval life or ignore its genuine hardships. But we also shouldn't dismiss everything about pre-modern life as primitive and miserable. Medieval people developed sophisticated solutions to human problems that modern people might benefit from understanding. The question isn't whether medieval peasants had it better or worse than modern people. It's what we can learn from how they organized their lives, communities, and economies. In some ways, they figured out aspects of human flourishing that modern society has forgotten. Medieval peasants proved that there are multiple ways to organize human society and that technological progress doesn't automatically mean progress in human welfare. Sometimes the old ways weren't worse, they were just different, and sometimes they were actually better. The next time someone tells you how terrible life was in the bad old days, remember that medieval peasants worked fewer hours, ate healthier food, lived in stronger communities, and had better work-life balance than many modern people. They weren't living in a golden age, but they weren't living in a nightmare either. They were just living differently, and maybe there's something we can learn from that.